let's get to Gaza. But this time, an issue in Gaza that the mainstream is really excited to cover. For once, the same mainstream in the Western world that did not cover the UN Human Rights Report, 49 pages detailing with firsthand testimonies and direct CCTV footage, like direct evidence that Israel has been doing mass rapes to the Palestinians as a weapon of war, and also simultaneously trying to ethnically cleanse the Palestinian population by shutting down hospitals where there are in vitro fertilization centers, by killing newborn children, shutting down the healthcare infrastructure on purpose. None of that gets a lot of coverage in the Western world, or when it does, it's barely it's barely a subheader. The lead is buried, Israel restarting the ceasefire is covered, but obviously under terms where Israel was just forced to do this, that sort of thing. But now that there are protests happening in Gaza that primarily want the bloodshed to stop, with definitely anti-Hamas protesters in the protests, the media is going, well, there it is. The Palestinians have finally had enough of Hamas. That's who they care the most about. They don't care about the bombs. The bombs are fine. It's Hamas that they care about. They think it's Hamas's fault that Israel is bombing them. Now, this is also being egged on by the Israeli command, for the record, like the Israeli military. Here, I have it from right here. This is important to understand. The protests against Hamas are being ordered by the Israeli military. They're not ordered. I wouldn't say they're ordered by the Israeli military. I don't fully agree with the statement from Zionism Observer, even though I believe Zionism Observer is a formative archiver of war crimes that I'm pretty sure international human rights groups are using as well. They primarily focus on archiving the war crimes that Israeli occupying force soldiers themselves post on the timeline. The defense minister Katz, who so far does not have an ICC arrest warrant, told Palestinians in Gaza they will lose their homes and more land if they don't join the protest. Here is Emmanuel Manny Fabian. He is the IDF military correspondent for the Think Times of Israel. He says, Defense Minister Israel Katz warns Palestinians in Gaza the military will soon operate in additional areas of the Strip, telling them to learn from the civilians in Beit Lahia who have been protesting against Hamas. Gaza residents, the IDF will soon operate with the intensity in additional areas in Gaza, and you will be required to evacuate for your protection from the combat zones, says in a video statement. The plans are ready and approved. Hamas is risking your life and will make you lose your homes and more land that will be added to the Israeli defense array. Learn from the residents of Beit Lahia as they did. You should also demand the removal of Hamas from Gaza and the immediate release of all Israeli hostages. This is the only way to stop the war, he adds. The protesters in Gaza are quite explicitly calling for an end to Israel's total siege, which is creating famine conditions and is in its fourth week. For Israeli officials to uplift those protests and not lift the siege is as cynical as it gets. Also, this is in Hebrew and not Arabic. What resident of Gaza is, there are some residents of Gaza that speak Hebrew, but understand that if Israel is speaking in Arabic, they're doing propaganda to the Arab population. It's usually with an intent to humiliate them. If they're speaking in Hebrew, they're doing propaganda for the Israeli population with an intent to humiliate the Palestinians and then, demonstrate a strong show of force. And if they're speaking in English, it is the most woke you've ever heard. It is the most like, I'm going to take the genocide that we're doing and explain it to you like we are the victims. Just remember, it's a very basic principle behind Israeli officials. So the fact that this is in Hebrew implies that this is not for the Palestinian population at all, but instead is for the Israeli population. And this is the statement that I just read out to you. He's just basically saying it. Now, of course, the primary purpose of the protests in Gaza are not to unseat Hamas in the way that the media is implying in the Western world. It is to stop the siege, stop the occupation. But beyond that, are there people who don't like Hamas in Gaza? Of course there are. The f*** do you mean? Of course. No group of individuals are monolithic. I've often talked about the Palestinian sentiment and the reporting coming out of dedicated pollsters that go into Gaza and into the West Bank during even this genocide and still actively survey the population. And time again, it is shown that Hamas is more popular in the West Bank in the eyes of the Palestinians in the West Bank than they are in Gaza. There needs to be a reason for that. Part of the reason is because, of course, people attribute the crimes of Israel in terms of like famine or in terms of the horrible conditions to administrative failures of Hamas as a political operative, as a political entity. Part of it is because they also think Hamas is corrupt, right? And that's fine. That's an understandable resentment that some Palestinians have. Most of those Palestinians don't actually talk shit about Hamas regardless, not because they're afraid that Hamas is going to come and kill them, but instead they don't talk shit about Hamas because they understand that the position of Hamas right now is an emancipatory one, and the position of Hamas right now is a defensive posture against Israel that's blowing them up. It's pretty basic stuff. How do you know this? Not only do I read, I also talk to Palestinian people. What's my position? It's very simple. I do not have any loyalty to any party. I do not care about who governs Gaza or the West Bank beyond the Palestinian people themselves. I want Palestinian people to have autonomy. I want Palestinian people to have sovereignty. That's what I care about. So if there is a major push, to vote for someone else into a position of power, and it certainly is not going to be Fatah, then fine. Like, that's great. Very controversial take, Hassan. I know. Very controversial. I don't know why a lot of people have mistaken Western defenders of Palestine and Palestinians as being dick riders entirely for Hamas. There is no, it doesn't matter. To me, Hamas is but a name. It's a name to a movement that is choosing to militarily resist against the Israeli occupation. You can say all these people are pro-Hamas across the board, but I have no political allegiances beyond the fact that they are the only game in town, and they are actively defending against Israeli incursions in the Gaza Strip. That's it. It's that simple. Just like if the Palestinians came together and had a free and fair election in a future, in a positive future that seems so far away right now, and they all universally voted for Hamas, I'm not going to sit here and be like, that's fucked up. That's it. So there it is. Mohammed Shahada, getting many questions about the demonstrations in Gaza. So here's my full assessment of the protests, their potential and limitations, genuineness and spontaneity versus outside influence, motives and goals, and their ability to actually challenge Hamas or bring the war close to an end. The protests seem to have started spontaneously in small numbers and in limited areas. Their grievances are unique. People are tired, desperate for the genocide to end at any cost. Many want Hamas to step down from government to take away Israel's pretext for the siege and killing. But the protests quickly drew the interest and influence of external actors keen to exploit Gazans' despair and pain, and this may end up undermining the movement instead of helping, e.g., Israel demanding Gazans take to the street or face death. Land theft and forever war will backfire. That's what Israel Katz said. When Israel suddenly blesses Palestinians' rights to expression against Hamas while detaining, maiming, and murdering those who exercising the same right against the occupation, it discourages people from taking part in the protest lest they be called Israel's collaborators. An apparent Fatah influence is detectable in some of today's protests, with the chant Ya Shia being added. This chant, accusing Hamas of being Iranian stooges, was popular in 2007 amongst Fatah partisans during the Fatah-Hamas conflict that saw the latter take over Gaza. Yeah, they're saying Hamas are Shia because Iran offers material support to Hamas. Israeli media identify one of the protesters today as someone whose family affiliated with Mohammed Dahlan's Fatah. Similarly, a Fatah influence on the demonstrations will make it easier for Hamas to dismiss/delegitimize them as pushed by an external agenda. So Israel actually pushing in favor of these protests and saying, like, you'll get fucking bombed if you don't take to the streets and demand that Hamas gets cast aside, is unironically going to cause people to not protest against Hamas. So that's the inherent irony here. That's it. That is the issue that a lot of people are not recognizing. But the Houthis are Shia, or am I wrong? Yes, they are. They are also backed by Iran, and Palestinians seemingly love those guys. So I don't think that there's a real sectarian attitude here. They don't give a shit. For them, it's like, we're getting dominated by Israel. We're getting murdered by Israel. Anyone that stops this is good. Anyone that stops this is my ally, because that is the highest order of priority. Now, what's ironic about these protests also is that, and this is something that a lot of people failed to recognize with October 7. People attribute October 7 to Hamas, and in large part, it was the Hamas militant wing that participated in the militancy, participated in the kidnapping. Having said that, however, in spite of their much smaller sizes and much smaller influence, every other facet of Palestinian political groups also participated in October 7 in a united front. October 7 wasn't just conducted by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. October 7 was actually conducted by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and numerous other even smaller formations. There were Fatah members that were also involved on October 7. So the idea that this is just Hamas is incorrect. Hamas itself also has maintained two positions that I think are quite significant. Position number one, the release of political leaders, including more popular political leaders than anyone Hamas has ever been able to produce from Israeli prisons. Political leaders who are directly at odds with Hamas, okay, both in ideology, but political leaders nonetheless that are interested in the end to the occupation. The second point that is very important is that Hamas has also said that they would disarm and dissolve their political apparatus if Israel ended its occupation tomorrow. So it's not like these guys are saying, we're staying here steadfast no matter what happens. The very fact that Hamas has also maintained the position that they would disband as long as there was no more occupation can be seen as like a veiled what's the term for it? Like a gamble, because they know that Israel will never stop, right? You can say that. But the reality is they've put it out there. And Israel has every opportunity to see it through if they chose to see it through. If they wanted to, they could just go back to bombing Gaza. No one's stopping them. A bluff. Thank you. Yeah. Israel could call their bluff, and yet they have chosen not to do that. That's also something to consider here. The protest messages are simple, uncontroversial, and realistic. We want to live, end the war, genocide. We want a peace and normal life. Hamas must step down from government. Some sent reassuring messages like, we're not against Hamas, but against this rule. However, actors trying to exploit these protests to escalate the messaging to the next level, e.g. demanding disarmament, fully dismantling Hamas, foreign government in Gaza, whitewashing Israel, framing Hamas as the sole problem, are undermining the potential of these demonstrations. Many Gazans want Hamas to step down from government, even inside Hamas itself. Many want a permanent ceasefire, but full disarmament is a very sensitive topic. The mere existence of any form of weapons in Gaza is seen by many as a deterrent against the IDF staying in Gaza forever. Why the fuck would you put down your arms if Israel does not fully withdraw their troops? You cannot have sovereignty, especially when you're sitting in the cheeks of an apartheid state that stole your land from the jump, without having a standing military. Full disarmament just makes it so that the Nakba is conducted over and over again. And in many instances, the Nakba is being conducted. Full disarmament also looks a lot like the West Bank, and not the parts like, I'm not talking about Tulkarm or I'm not talking about Jenin, but parts of the West Bank that Israel currently occupies and dominates. That's what it looks like. If you want to know what it looks like for the day-to-day existence of Palestinians being dominated under the cruel rule of the Israeli apartheid, look no further than the West Bank, where they, as recently as this past week, actually allowed right-wing settlers to go and engage in a lynch mob against Hamdan Bilal, who was literally sitting right here only a couple weeks prior to that, and then went on to win an Oscar for the documentary that he co-directed called No Other Land. The IDF turned around and arrested him. They detained him. They kidnapped him. It's insane. The protest demands end the war, Hamas step down from government have been largely accepted by Hamas, who has been calling for a permanent end to the war and accepted ceding governance to a technocratic PA Gov or an independent administrative committee. Israel says no to both. Even if Hamas is toppled by these governments, Israel is unlikely to accept an alternative form of Palestinian governance, an IDF withdrawal from Gaza, or an end to the war. Netanyahu maintains a veto on all of the above, and depopulating Gaza remains Israel's priority. The more Israel talks about emptying out Gaza, the lesser those protests and potential, and more strength Hamas will draw by portraying itself as the only entity that can prevent or at least challenge this scenario and make the IDF stay in Gaza costly. Add to this, the continuation of Israeli attacks probably be the biggest factor in limiting the expansion of these demonstrations. Israeli mouthpieces called on Gazans to demonstrate in certain areas that were then bombed by the IDF. The genocide creates a rallying around the flag effect that strengthens Hamas's survival. What Israel failed to accomplish in 16 months of total war, it won't succeed to get by demanding starved and desperate Gazans march to its tune. Popular demonstrations usually succeed by disrupting life, shutting down the economy, making it impossible for the government to function and its leaders to move around. Israel did all of this and more already. There's nothing left protesters can do to pressure Hamas amid genocide. Ultimately, a true popular reckoning with Hamas can only happen once there is a ceasefire at the ballot boxes. Nonetheless, the protests are a natural right to Gazans who have been through hell on their own for 60 months. No one outside has a right to lecture them. Exactly. And I'm never going to sit here and be like, how dare they protest against Hamas? If that was the expectation that you had of me, you are delusional. And I know that there were plenty of people who were waiting for the opportunity to be like, see, Hassan loves Hamas, but Palestinians hate Hamas. That's not the case. It is an infinitely more complicated equation than the one that you present. And the reason why you're presenting this equation is because you want it to be true. You want it to be so that Israel is not the bad guy in the situation. Ask every Palestinian whether they despise Hamas or not. They will tell you that Israel is still the arch enemy. The only Palestinians that won't say that are Palestinians that get paid by the Israeli state, like the son of Hamas, who is a fucking Mossad agent, who is the most Islamophobic piece of shit terrorist I've ever encountered in my entire life. It's also guys like Aziz or whatever, the John Aziz, the peaceful poet, people that don't live in fucking Palestine, but will regularly do commentary that is defensive of Israel. So there it is.